Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Hi Christy, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see some faces I know on here.
Yeah, good to see you too. This is awesome. If anybody else wants to come on camera, feel free. This is going to be a fun discussion, and you're all welcome to participate in the discussion because we know many of you have lots of good questions and insights on this topic as well. So, yeah, this is the third in a four-part series that we're doing on communication and partnerships, and being brought to you by the California Grazing Lands Coalition and California Rangeland Trust. So real quick, I'll introduce Robin Hanson, who's the program manager, and Alex Carroll, who is coordinator at Cal GLC. And I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves. But real quick before that, again, we're a small group, so please, you can throw questions in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and come off mute, feel free. We'll keep this very discussion based. We have some questions for Chris and Lily. But yeah, we'll just have a good time here today. So I'm excited about this topic. I'm Bree Owens. I ranch up in Tehama County in California, also chair the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition, and have worked in partnership with groups all over the West, mostly within ranching and livestock and rangelands, and have collaborated over the years a lot with researchers in those landscapes. And so this is like a topic that is just, I feel like I have a lot of passion around, and how do we do this better as we continue to work together and solve issues out there. So with that, I am going to let Chris and Lily introduce themselves. Chris, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Holvey. I'm the lead scientist and founder at Working Lands Conservation, and we're a small nonprofit based up in Logan, Utah. Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Chris. Lily?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lily. I am a ORISE fellow at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station down in Du Bois, Idaho. And I've been working on this project for about a little less than 2 years at this point.
Awesome. Which I love, because I feel like having a conversation with you both, and you're at different points in your careers and in partnerships with communities and others that you work with. So it's kind of, yeah, you guys have cool perspectives and having been longer in your career and new in this career. So this will be great. Okay. Yeah, share a bit more about projects that you are working on. Go ahead, Chris, jump right in.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a couple of projects across the West. One of our main projects, which we really call our flagship project, is a project called Three Creeks Grazing. It is in the northeastern corner of Utah. And this is a really neat project where 38 ranchers came together to graze differently across a big chunk of public land. So it's 138,000 acres. And it's Forest Service land and BLM land, private land, state land, all sorts of good stuff there. And they were facing some litigation for land health standards back in 2011, so a while ago now, and came up with a really unique way to face those, which was combining together as a group, creating a company, and then changing their grazing across this whole system. So they combined their herds into just two, and they started rotating across this landscape much more rapidly. And they also now leave 20% of the landscape rested every year. And so our role in this project, we weren't there from the beginning, but about halfway through, we started doing some work up on this landscape and really looking at how kind of the historical grazing systems across the landscape were affecting a suite of ecosystem services. And then after the grazing switch, looking at a before-after comparison of land health across the system. So we as a group are ecologists, but we work really closely with communities, and a lot of the work, there's this ecological side of doing monitoring, but then there's a lot of work in developing relationships and really creating and doing science and monitoring that matters to people on this landscape.
Cool. I am a huge fan of, well, I'm a huge fan of you guys at Working Lands Conservation, also the Three Creeks Project and the whole community there. And I think it's just exciting and innovative, what's happening, and old school too, which is great. So Lily, will you, share about like the experiment station? And I feel like, I don't know, a little bit like Chris kind of was sharing, like the impetus, right, of the threat of a lawsuit. And I feel like the sheep station has dealt with a lot over the years, and ups and downs and challenges and support and lack of support. But then also just like as a resource for the community and the sheep industry, it's ebbed and flowed and evolved. And so I'm curious, like where you guys are headed right now, and the collaborative project that you're working on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bree. You're right. I think the sheep station has really had a really, I think, really big role in the surrounding area. So if you're unfamiliar where Du Bois, Idaho is, it's right outside the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but very much still connected to the park and to the wildlife that come in and out of the park. And it's just a very hot topic type of area when it comes to conservation and also grazing and ranching. So there's kind of this nexus of goals and land uses that want to be expressed on the landscape in different ways. And the sheep station has really been, I would say, a really important tool for local ranch operations, particularly sheep operations in the past. But because of its location and because specifically in high country allotments, there's been a lot of litigation around conflict with big predators like grizzly bear specifically. There has been enough of that conflict and a real potential threat to actually the sheep station shutting down that it was really imperative for all of or for the work at the station to really be focused on collaborative efforts and to bring in as many different perspectives, specifically those perspectives that hold kind of the litigation side of things. So the conservationists and the environmental protection agencies, those kinds of people, like to the table to find solutions moving forward that can ideally serve both the grazing community, which is the purpose of the sheep station, and to be doing that in the best way possible so that we can really coexist with these big megafauna and other threatened species that are really important, and rightfully so. So that's kind of what our big ask is and what we're really moving into. Over the last 2 years now, we have been working on a collaboratory effort we're calling the Rangeland Collaboratory, which is, as I said, bringing diverse viewpoints to the table, specifically looking to bring in environmentalist and conservationist concerns into what we do at the sheep station, and from that to create an adaptive management plan. So really what we want to do at the sheep station is take all of this conflict that we've been experiencing and turn it into a research question and see if we can, through research, through the experimental lab, come up with really innovative, potentially, solutions.
Yeah. I feel like oftentimes, right, collaboration can evolve out of conflict and trying to address challenges on the landscape, different perspectives. So it's both like can be the reason, and also we find a ton of power in it because it brings together different perspectives. And earlier, let's see, I had mentioned with you guys, I've been reading through Haley Wilmer's latest paper. I should say Wilmer et al. There's a lot of other people on it. But there is a line from it that I was thinking about a lot and for our conversation, and now it kind of came back up as you guys are talking about this. And I'm going to just read it because, okay, it says, creating the conditions where proactive teams interested in transcending conservation ag conflicts see an opportunity for high reward scientific approaches to leverage social friction for productive collaboration. I mean, that's a lot of like really big fancy words, but essentially like, right, that we can take these challenges and find the opportunity, and like, how do we use science and research as a tool to have like address in a healthy way this conflict that does exist. And I think that that's what you guys and, you know, organizations, agencies that you're representing, that is the intent. And that is what I see you guys doing. But I want to dive like more into that because it's like a huge opportunity, but it's challenging. Like, this is not easy work what you guys are doing. And it's, you know, one thing to go in and set up a research project as a set of scientists in a more controlled setting, but you guys are working in like huge landscapes with a lot of diverse partners. That is super complex. So yeah, let's just like, let's get into the meat of it, the enticing parts. What does, I mean, we'll start with easy. What does community involvement look like? Just logistically, like how are you guys working with community and other partners?
Yeah, I can say here, well, I'll say for Three Creeks, but we've found that whenever we are working on a project with a group, and it's always started with a local champion. So somebody in the community or who really knows the community that invites us in, that has the trust of the community. And that's a really big first step for us. So, you know, we can look at remotely sensed tools, we can look at soils maps, we can learn a lot about the landscape from far away, but you know, that doesn't mean much if you're just creating your own questions of how to apply all that information to the landscape. So having somebody invite you in and start the dialogue with the community is really important. So I think that's always a first step. And I'll leave it there and maybe let Lily jump in too.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for our project specifically, we've just really had an open door policy to the extent to which we can. You know, we are a federal branch, you know, ARS is a federal entity, so there are certain, you know, limitations, rules, regulations that we have to follow within what we do. And I don't really know what those are. That's not really my role, but I know that there are some limitations that, you know, we do have in terms of where our funding is, and I won't even get into it, but that's a question for Haley. But we really, to the extent that we can, we have a really open door policy with this collaborative. And I think that we've really extended ourselves in that way to be like, hey, come in, look at what we're doing, be part of our work. We don't want to be walled off. Like, we want to be transparent. We want people to know what we're doing. We want to involve, and more importantly, we want to involve them in the process. Whereas I think before there was a little bit more of like a separation between the sheep station and some of these other groups. And we don't want that approach to be central to the station anymore. So that's kind of been our approach, is just really letting people into our process and inviting them. So basically that's on a practical level, that's just looked like reaching out to organizations that we know we need to collaborate with. And maybe it's not, you know, maybe it's not the organizations that have been super excited about us in the past or that have backed us in the past, but even more important to collaborate with them, or at least to try. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken. And I really truly believe that there has already been a lot of really great progress and traction that's come out of that.
The history piece and right, the history, the context piece, I think, and it's mentioned, and so the framework that's outlined in the paper I just shared in the chat, that's one of there's kind of 4 core elements of the framework that's shared in the paper. around like co-production of research, and that history piece is one, and the history of conflict or collaboration and successes and failures there. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that, and like how has that shifted the dynamic? And Chris, you mentioned like having a champion, being invited into the community, but also like, I guess specifically, I'm curious, like, how does it kind of shift the expectation for you guys coming in and around like the pace at which you can work and do co-production?
I don't always have to go first, Lily, but I'll go first again this time. Yeah, so I think, you know, one thing that we've adopted as an organization is the phrase moving at the speed of trust. And so really working to figure out what the community and all the partners are ready for. And, you know, I'm placing this in 3 Creeks, you know, what are the 37 ranchers ready for us to be sharing with them as far as a study goes? What else do they want to learn? What is the BLM ready for us to be monitoring and sharing with them? So making those relationships, and you know, previously we might have outlined an entire study. Previously, when I was a professor at a university, we might have outlined an entire study on a 3-year time horizon, because that's what a grant cycle is. But in the work that we're doing now, you know, we've been working at 3 Creeks now for 11 years, and the relationship keeps growing and moving and shifting, and the research questions are evolving, and it shifted from some needs for monitoring particular things because of land health standards to people becoming engaged in the process of learning and asking questions. So, for example, is this new grazing system going to affect soil carbon, and can we measure that, and can you help us? And so that question didn't come until year 6, right? So, you know, it's a really different timeline than in the past for our group.
Yeah, and Bree, would you mind just repeating the question? Like, was it about like timeline with the collaboration, just like knowing what to do at what pace?
Yeah, and how I mean, even more broadly, how are you guys navigating the history of the place and the history of partnerships, or you know, non-partnerships with the communities that you're working with? And then yeah, specifically around, does it have ramifications on the pace at which you can do your work?
Okay. Yeah, so ARS, which is the Agricultural Research Service, hasn't done a co-produced science effort like this yet. So this is like a very novel thing for ARS. Like this is like a first time like swing at this with ARS. So but Haley Wilmer, who is my supervisor and I work with on this project, I think that she's kind of led the process like in a very sustainable way. So I know before I was signed on, there was a lot of just discussion with people, like kind of, I wouldn't say like off the record, but just you know, no recording or anything like that, just like meeting on the landscape, just like hearing what people have to say. What are some of the issues that are coming up? What should we do next? You know, we have this, we want this, we're looking at this funding package. We know we have to do some, you know, collaborative work. And really it was the ranchers and the people that work closely with us that were like, you need to do co-produced research. Like you need to bring these people to the table, because things are never really going to get resolved unless you do. And so I think that was part of the impetus for us, is like, okay, well, you know, our job as the sheep station is to provide support to the agricultural community. And if the agricultural community is asking for this specifically, then like that is a way that we can provide support to them. But but also to the region, you know, because it does really have regional implications. There isn't just grazing in the Greater Yellowstone on sheep station allotments. There's grazing in the Greater Yellowstone all across the region. So we hope that from what we do here, it could produce kind of a model of collaborative adaptive management, co-produce science that then the people who are participating, they can take that to other federal organizations or other organizations that they're working with and be like, hey, this worked here, like maybe we should put it here. Like that's not something that ARS can do, but we can do the science and be like, well, this is kind of our model for co-produced science. And I think, yeah, I mean, like that open door policy, like I was saying, it definitely, and I was kind of alluding to this as well, you know, when there is litigation involved, that just requires a little preparation. So if we are opening the doors to people who have previously had, you know, lawsuits, I guess you could just say, with us in the past, that just requires us to be prepared on our end. But it doesn't necessarily prohibit anything. It's just more so okay, how can we just like be prepared? We've never done this before. And again, like it's just kind of that like novel approach, because changing the dynamic in this situation is just something that's never been tried, you know? And so we really hope for the best. And I think we're doing everything that we can to make sure that this has a positive outcome for everyone involved. But, you know, this is research and it is an experiment at the end of the day.
I just last week recently I got to attend this amazing facilitation workshop, and anyways, it's resonating because they were, you know, part of the discussion was like prep work is like 50 to 75% of the process and success, and just like, yeah, getting all of those things and the prep work that is done with participants and community, not just your own personal individual prep work, but then going into that community prep work. That's awesome. Okay, I'm curious too, like thinking about, I feel like there's a lot around like kind of navigating expectations and opportunities, and it's unique for each of you because Lily, as you said, you're working within like a federal agency type of situation. Chris, you're working within like private nonprofit situation. And so I think the opportunities that can be slightly different, also a lot of overlap, but like, what have you dealt with in terms of navigating expectations, both with the community that you're working with? And I mean, I feel like oftentimes there's like, you're the scientist, like answer this for us, give us an answer. And it's kind of like, well, that's not quite how this works, or maybe it is. So how do you navigate that with the community, and then maybe expectations from more peripheral partners too?
Okay, I can go first this time. Yeah, so I think in our situation, we've actually had to have a lot of continuous conversations and kind of like bring the conversation back to research like quite a few times. I think that we've had to share kind of over and over again with our group the value of research in this context, because I think that there's been a lot of perceptions that, you know, there's no more room for research in this dynamic between agriculture and or like sheep grazing specifically and grizzly bear conflict. Like, what is there left to know, you know? So we've really had to kind of challenge that thinking, just in the sense of maybe there isn't a place for research anymore. Like we aren't naive enough to think that research itself can like solve this problem. You know, like there's a lot of layers to this. There's cultural layers, there's conflict, there's identity connections, like there's a lot here. But what we have tried to impress on our collaborators and tried to kind of share with them is the potential value of this experiment and how the implications of it could potentially shape like a whole new dynamic. Kind of like this idea that Haley introduced me to, where it's like you have two sides of the issue and you try to find solutions in the middle. Well, really what we're trying to do is actually like transform the conflict and kind of like create a new baseline. So we've been trying to lead our group, I think, in that direction, and just like continuously asking the questions around like, hey, like what is unclear, or like, do you think that it's necessary for us to do research? Do you think this could be beneficial? And just, we're not here to advise anyone. This is what we can do. We are researchers. This is a research lab. And so this is how we can contribute. And so I think that has been a little bit of a mindset shift for some of our collaborators who just aren't really, don't have both feet in the research space. And that's fair, So that's kind of been, I think, one of our challenges. But I think to really address that, we've continued to just have conversations in person, online, and just really familiarity. And that does take time, especially with designing a adaptive management plan with people. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that when it comes to like the sideboards of the project, the objectives, what we're measuring, what we want to measure, what we don't really care about measuring, and for people who necessarily aren't scientists, that's a big learning curve. So we have just been taking our time with that and helping where we can to eliminate kind of confusion, but also really just looking to the group to kind of fuel itself in a way when it comes to building this plan, because we don't want to come down from like here, this is our plan. Like, of course, like we have limitations as a research station. We only have this many scientists. We only have this amount of funding. We can only there are certain things that are constraining, but within that, we do have a really amazing opportunity. So I've been really encouraged, because I think recently that's been kind of gaining some steam and momentum with our collaborators.
I hadn't, well, yeah, I was gonna say I hadn't thought much about this, but I think we have, because we've talked about, and Chris and I have talked about this with others of, all of us with the different hats we wear, coming in and being able to share like what our challenges and opportunities are with the roles we play. But I hadn't really taken that as far as like what you just shared, Lily, of really having to come in and explain like the opportunity and like the value proposition of science, like in research in the space. And I feel like oftentimes as like ranchers, we're like, well, we have to tell people what ranching is, because there's such a disconnect of what the day-to-day and logistics of ranching is.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's also like the day-to-day and the logistics of really good research.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. I'm going to keep thinking on that one, and yeah, I'm going to show up with more grace. Chris, yeah, did you want to share?
Yeah, I think that it's varied immensely from project to project. I think in some projects, when we join a partnership, there's a slow relearning of what science can bring to the table, because I think oftentimes experimental science and monitoring are conflated, and they can be exactly the same thing, but oftentimes putting just monitoring into practice doesn't necessarily mean that you're answering questions you want to answer. So I think the process of science is really focusing on things you want to learn and then figuring out how to answer those questions. And so sometimes people monitor, but haven't really specified the question they're trying to answer, haven't really thought about where they're monitoring and if they're going to get to that answer. And so I think that leaves, a taste in people's mouth of thinking that they're not going to learn anything from this process of science. And so I think in some cases, it's a slow sharing of information and people being excited about the perspective that we're bringing to the table, and then sharing the perspectives, how it matches up with perspectives that they're seeing on the landscape. And that gets really exciting, because then that's when the co-learning really starts unfolding. I think at other times, it's more of, oh, you're the scientist, you must know everything about everything on the landscape. And being like, well, actually, you probably know more about your landscape, about much of this. This is what we understand about science, or what we can understand about processes on your landscape from what we already know, but there's a lot we don't know. And so there's that building of trust also, and just getting to know each other's skill sets and defining what is the science that we're doing together. And I think it comes back again in both cases to figuring out what the questions really are that we are asking together as a group, what we want to learn, and then bringing the right group of skills to the table. And we provide some of those at times. I always look at our science as a toolbox. So we bring our tools to the table, and then other people bring their other tools to the table, and together we put them together to answer questions about what we want to learn about a landscape.
Yeah. It makes me think too, and such in the like, what is the value of science, data collection, monitoring, and kind of thinking of like an ebb and flow of the needs. And there's all these other elements on the landscape, right? There's this value of the data collection for different purposes, but then also thinking like what communities and what ranchers are dealing with, right? In terms of policy and regulation and economics and markets and even just cultural shifts, like local and big scale cultural shifts. And so I was thinking, like, as you guys were sharing this, that
Yeah.
how does that ebb and flow fit? And like at what, yeah, think about like the pace of like science and research and how we need to be moving. And maybe there are times where like we really need to focus on that bucket, right? Of like within that bigger complex like system and what communities are navigating. We really need to like put resources and emphasis into data collection. And then maybe it's other times like we need to slow down and let those other elements of regulation and policy, and again like markets, like catch up, because maybe that becomes the underlying issue or the kind of root cause of what a community is dealing with. Anyway, so I was thinking about shifts in that of like energy and focus for these communities. But also curious because, and again, like Chris and I have talked about this and been involved in discussions, and I'm sure like with the research station, you guys are too, of like monitoring at different scales and different metrics for, again, Chris, to your point of like, what is the question? What are we trying to get at? What are we trying to collect data on? And so how have you guys learned, or how are you thinking about, because you're very, very place-based, which is awesome, and very community focused in some of your work. But I know like some of the work that the experiment station has been involved in goes into like partnering with other researchers and other communities, and so it can kind of scale up. And Chris, I know you've been working with partners in other communities across the West, and so I'm curious like your thoughts on this of, you know, what we can learn when we're so intimately connected to a community, to those people in that place and that landscape and those dynamics. Are you finding there are things that you can learn that, yeah, you can take up to larger scales? What's kind of that relationship for you guys? Does this question make sense? If it doesn't, I can rephrase it. Or you can just answer whatever comes
I
to mind.
think that for us, you'll have to tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but for us, the things that we're learning are all the social things. And so it's how to build trust, how to show up with grace, how to formulate questions with communities. Those are the skill sets. It's only scaling because we're learning it and applying it in other places. I think the science, what we learn in a place, let's say when we monitor soil carbon, sort of scales. There's a lot that needs to be learned about that, so yes, we can take some of those ideas to other places, but I think it's more for us, the folks in our group, they are, all master's and PhD level scientists, and you were not taught in a ecology program how to partner with groups of people. And so the real practice for us in these local groups is getting better at that, and then listening and learning the types of questions that will resonate in other places too. So learning about the ranch dynamics, learning about the economics of the ranch, because those are going to be important with all communities we work with.
Yeah, and so I didn't mention this before, but I am a social scientist. That's why I was hired on the project. And so I agree with Chris in this. I think everything that we're learning socially, which is a lot, part of our project is kind of like three prongs, I guess, to it in terms of what we want to know. One is looking at the ecology and the vegetation data. Another is social science related. And then the third is looking at the domestic sheep and looking at like nutrition and genetics on that side.
Mm-hmm.
And so the social science is definitely just as important to the project as is like the vegetation monitoring. And for me, I'm kind of like monitoring the social dynamics. But that sounds kind of weird because it's like, I don't know. It just feels kind of weird. I'm not trying to monitor people. It's just like there has to be, for the social science for us, which is a very kind of like semi-structured nature. So it involves interviews, also all of our in-person meetings, and then kind of various other activities that we'll do throughout the year, kind of like check-ins and things like that. There is kind of a analysis process from that we are able to write about in our manuscripts and to share back with our community, with the collaborative. And I think that has been, whatever we find from there can definitely scale. And I think overall, the one of the really big outcomes that we want from this is to develop a collaborative adaptive management framework that our stakeholders can then take to other organizations or to whatever groups that they want to, like that's kind of what when we signed this grant and when we got this money, that was one of the outcomes that we wanted to achieve. And so that definitely remains today. And so that's definitely always in the front of our mind when we're scheduling events and, just going about this collaboratory at a month to month, basis. But one other thing that I'll mention about that is that with the social science piece, sometimes that can be a little confronting for people, stakeholders, or our collaborative to kind of receive. And that doesn't mean that, everything that I present from our analysis, as social scientists, Haley and I, like, it doesn't mean that that's like the golden rule. It doesn't mean that that's right. It means that that's what we're seeing from the most objective lens that we can have. But of course, like, we want to present that back to get feedback. Like, oh, is this actually, we're finding a large group of our stakeholders are having this mental model. Does that resonate for you or not? And sometimes there will be like specific words that I'll use that will really get some people upset that they don't like those words, and so I think the social science part of it can draw out a lot. And it's not meant to be like putting people in boxes or, analyzing people on it's not about that, but it is about understanding the people that we're working with on a deeper level so that we can collaborate more effectively, share suggestions for how to talk to these kinds of diverse groups, and also to inform other research labs who may be looking to do something similar in terms of like, hey, you should ask your group these questions. Like, these questions for us really gave us a lot of info about our participants and really helped us inform our strategy as a collaborative, like moving forward. So that's kind of how I see that playing out.
I want to touch on Alex's question in the chat. So he said, how can different mindsets like managing for what we want versus managing for what we don't want affect science and research, or does it? And I'm curious if you guys have seen that show up with like the partners in the communities, whether it's producers or agency folks. And I think we have a very real tendency and history of, in our culture, managing for what we don't want and trying to eradicate things and get rid of things. And whether it's, weeds or certain other species on the landscape, we do tend to manage against things. And there's definitely a shift I see within the ag community and the broader conversation with partners too around shifting into managing for what we want. And I can kind of see this because I am more familiar with the Three Creeks project and Chris's work than the sheep station. I think I can see this like in those conversations. But yeah, where do you guys see that coming in, and where do you think research can play a role in fostering and enabling that type of question versus what we don't want?
Yeah, I think that for me, the kind of work that we get to do now is working with groups of people that are thinking outside the box. And so working together to envision something totally new and try to create it. And that whole inspiration came out of, trying to get away from things we don't want. We don't want, water quality that doesn't meet state standards. We don't want bad sage grouse habitat. But the solutions for that historically were just to take cows off allotments. And so they weren't the right solutions for the community. And so the whole project formed around, okay, can we just imagine what we might want to create here? And so I think that that's really powerful, starting to just think outside the box. I think as the scientists on that project, we got it a little easy. We just have to say if it's working. The hard work was the community envisioning that whole new system of getting to where they wanted to be. And we get to say if we're getting there, and then say it in a way where we, there's data that doesn't tell you much, but there's data that leads to action. And so our goal is to create data that people can really make decisions off of and do adaptive management. So if that water quality isn't where you want it to be, we know why, and there are decisions people can make about moving cows differently across the landscape that they will take up the next year.
I have seen, I think this connects. In one of our meetings, this actually came up, I think, and it's a little bit different, but again, I think it connects. So we were struggling with identifying with a method versus connecting with an objective or goal. So I mean, take any method, any maybe restoration method, and it's like, well, we want to do this thing, but the why behind it or the objective was sometimes a little bit harder to get to. It was more like, we just know that this method is a good thing, but we don't really have the idea or the full idea as to what we want to get to, like what do we want this method to actually do for us. And again, that could be like a restoration method or whatever. So that I've seen that kind of come up with some of our discussions as a group. And I think we've been, because we're doing a research process, we have to have all components, and we can't just focus on the methods. We have to focus on like the outcomes and the objectives. And so that kind of forces us to be like, okay, like it's great if we like this method, like this method could work in 99% of cases, but we just have to know why we want to use it. And we want to know if we do use it, and then we can monitor if it works. How do we know if it works? Like, what are the characteristics of the landscape that we want to happen or exist after this method is complete? Like, what are we looking for? A certain type of, vegetation structure, like what, or more of a certain species, like how do we know if this method works? And that's kind of brought us into the discussion of indicators as a group as well, like indicators for success that we that are important to the collaborative research adaptive management process.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I totally have an indicators question for you guys based on this, but I also I love this. I'm really into like the 5 whys or the whys. Like I'm like the 4-year-old, the toddler in the room. Why? But why? And I think to that point, like, there's the method, but it's like, okay, the why and to what end? Like, okay, to what end? To what end? To what end? So yeah, that is hitting home for me right now. Big, but also I want to go values. Like Chris mentioned values, like Lily, I think, as social scientists, and it's coming up like community values. And I wanted how, and maybe this has shifted over time, how intentional, or so I guess maybe it's more not intentional, but how direct or indirect are you in the conversations you're having with communities and partners about eliciting values and understanding those underlying values of the community? Because it would be easy to come into like either one of these communities and say like, oh, well, they hold a value of livestock production. Like we know that, or we could assume that they're all Republicans because they live in rural Western communities, right? But there's a lot of assumptions we could make. But obviously that could lead us in wrong directions. We know what assumptions, are made of. So I guess, I'm curious, like how direct do you get about having conversations around values, or do you go at that through kind of indirect, because we can all be a little uncomfortable sharing our feelings?
Yeah, I think, through interviews, we kind of get in there, in terms of like, what do people want to share? You have an hour to talk about what you want to see on the landscape, what your goals are, like we're asking a lot of, I guess like informative questions around values, but it actually kind of sparked an idea for me. I think it would be really cool to actually like put a couple of values on like a piece of paper that we know that some of our stakeholders hold, and then just ask people to kind of like self-report or like rank them, because you might have like your top value being like wildlife protection, but like where does food systems rank for you? Is it all about at the bottom, or is it just, second down or whatever? I think that would be so interesting to see. So yeah, I mean, that's, we don't ask that, we haven't asked that question super directly. I do think that it comes out through interviews and also through discussion. I mean, it's hard to not talk about what you value, especially when we're really discussing these hot topic kind of like conversations, so it definitely comes out, but it's not something that we've directly got to. And I think most of that is because this is a research project. And so we want to keep it to like, okay, what are your goals and objectives for this? The values is like more of like a qualitative, like social side, which I think adds like more understanding and depth for us and potentially as a group fully. But because, I mean, doing a research project with a lot of people, there's a lot, there's a lot to like get through on that end alone, so yeah.
For us, when I was a professor, I taught a capstone class for the range major, and we always worked with a rancher, and our class would go out and develop a management plan on his property. And he would come in and talk about partnerships, and he would always start with, we start our relationship where we agree. And if we start there, it can grow around that. And I feel like that is very much how we approach the work that we do on landscapes is we get out, everybody values that landscape and has curiosity about it. And, I think people like to put values into Republican, Democrat, these really opposed things, but values are complex and overlapping and not exclusionatory. And, just because you have one value doesn't mean you're in one bin of people. And this love for land and place and curiosity and wanting to learn just spans so much. And there's so much to explore within those values that it's so exciting just to be there. And so that's really where we build a lot of the relationship. And like I said earlier, we have a lot of tools that we can bring to the table. We don't see that it's our role to say you should use these tools for this purpose. We have these tools. We want to listen to how you love the land and where, like you were saying, Lily, you know, what are the objectives for this management, the why, and let's all get there. Because, you know, one objective for healthier, thriving landscapes might be slightly different from another objective, but they're both probably wonderful in so many ways. And so I think that's how we approach values. You know, we spend a lot of time in the field, you know, digging holes with people and looking at plants. And then we spend a lot of time at dinner tables too. And conversation has never turned to politics. We've always found many other things that we all value to talk about.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the indicators because I'm curious about this. And so like as researchers and thinking about like methods, what has changed for you guys and how are you thinking? Like Chris, you mentioned like, you know, collecting data for a purpose of the early like issue at Three Creeks, but also now like thinking about like giving them information to help inform their management. So what are you guys finding and how has it shifted for you in thinking about different types of indicators? And are you focusing in on certain indicate, like has the community aspect, the co-production aspect led you into monitoring for different indicators that you didn't initially set out to monitor for?
Yeah, definitely. You know, we were initially monitoring for a lot of ecological indicators. And now we also are looking at economics and also looking at cattle health indicators, which tie to economics, and asking questions of communities of, is this grazing system program working for you? Why or why not? So yes, they become more of the three-legged stool of indicators, you know, so ecological, social, economic. Within the ecological indicators, you know, I think we're always looking for the indicators that will answer the question the easiest way, most fully to what people want to understand. And so we're not tied to any indicators. They shift as the questions shift.
Yeah, we're in the same boat, Chris, and I think that's something that, I mean, of course, we're aware of, but in terms of this project has become more of focus because it's just really important information to know when we're thinking about grazing systems and the removal of certain parts of the grazing system, aka like high elevation grazing, and like how that actually impacts the entire just transhumance operations in general. And so I think that's been really interesting, I think, for the group and for me too, because maybe from like a conservation perspective, and I think that this might be something that I've noticed through conversations and some of the data that we've collected so far, is that there might actually be kind of a lack of understanding or kind of like two ships passing in the night situation when it comes to the importance of high elevation grazing to pastoralism, transhuman systems overall. And I think the economics can answer that question in a way that is digestible for people. You know, like, of course, there's a cultural significance to having a transhuman operation that maybe people could express like through language, through like a story, through storytelling, but when it comes to more of the hard facts, like the presentation pieces, I think the economics can kind of tell that story quite quite succinctly, because if they're not in the high elevation grazing, then where are they? And like, what kind of cost does that look like? So it's just added a new layer, I think, to the project that has been, I've learned a lot through it. And hopefully the other people who have been listening into those conversations have too.
I love that you guys both brought that up. I've been thinking a lot about, right, the concept of stewardship economies, and we talked about this on a previous call conversation and in other places. And the idea too of like the three-legged stool and we have the Venn diagram, you know, that always shows like the ecological and the economic and the social. And there's like that little sweet spot in the middle. And when we draw the Venn diagram that way, it seems like, oh, that's really challenging because we got to find like that little sweet spot. And I think it actually doesn't give us the clear picture of those circles can shift, right? And the overlap can shift. And I think that's what you're getting at is that like we can actually bring those circles way into more alignment, that there's actually more alignment than disalignment of those circles. And that to me is like what a stewardship economy is. Anyways, but I think that's cool. And I think it's cool to think about how your guys' work and as researchers in partnership with these communities can help actually to clarify where that increased alignment is. Okay, I really want to like open it up and like encourage like Christy Wyckoff. What do you got? Please, questions, comments.
So
anything.
many comments. Well, one, I love the idea of that Venn diagram maybe having some like little margins where, yeah, you could probably pull it off if you're in one of those circles, but really like it performs best when it's overlapping. Chris, I adored the comment about like your guys' job in some ways was easy, whereas like the community having to completely shift their frame of reference and like blow up their paradigms and think about this in a totally different way. That's the hard work. And I don't think that gets enough attention. Is that like we're asking people to depart from long practices and heritage and, you know, family legacies and things like that. And so that's super powerful. Actually, Lily, my question for you was, I'm super interested to hear that some of the participants are people who actually were suing you guys at some point or suing the federal government. How did they come to the table? You know, Chris kind of has like a ready-made group to work with where she's not trying to pull in the maybe the dissenters in the communications. But it sounds like you guys have had a pretty diverse stakeholder group and bringing those voices in. I know this is something Bree always is thinking about is like, how do we really represent the community we're trying to serve, even the ones that really disagree with us? So if you could just talk a bit more about how that group came together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question, for sure. I think maybe this sounds a little too simple, but I think that just asking goes a really long way. And that's like not something people do, you know, like if there's like if there's a lot of like conflict that's very ingrained and very, you know, it takes the next step to the legal side of things. I don't think that there has been, at least not in the sheep station arena, there hasn't been like an opening, an offer. And to be honest, like everyone we asked, with maybe the exclusion of one, was like, sure, why not? Like, sure, we'll give it a shot, you know. And they're just like, we love what we love, and like we might have hard lines in the sand, but if you guys want to collaborate, like, okay, you know. And I think maybe it seems too simple, but I think that in our case, that's what it was. Like, we were like, okay, this isn't working. We're going to try to just ask these people to show up. And I think there's a way to approach it too, you know, like if there's no trust at all, like there just has to be like a full transparency of like, hey, this is what we're doing. This is like what we plan to do. We would love you to be a part of it. And this is what we would like your this is what we would like to see in terms of your contribution. This is what we're asking of everyone, you know, they have to know what they're getting into, you know, but on the other side of that, I think it really is that invitation. One of the people that was involved in past, lawsuits with us was basically like, no one's ever asked me to collaborate. And we're like, glad to be the first, you know? But yeah, I mean, it is kind of that kind of mind-blowing thing of like, maybe just ask, and, you know, coming from that place of just wanting to learn and just being like, hey, you know, we know that all of this went down. Like no one's joking around about that. Like we know that this is serious, and we think that this is the only way forward. We have this funding. We want to do research together. Would you want to be part of it? And I think it takes a little while for people to warm up to the idea and kind of like get their feet wet and start to meet people and just kind of learn the lay of the land, you know. But I think also having a really great facilitator is important. So if you do plan to have kind of a collaborative meeting where everyone's in the same room, I would highly recommend getting a really good facilitator, at least in the beginning, because that can dispel a lot of tension and can keep things on track. Because I think the probably worst case scenario is things getting way off track, like the train just going in a completely wrong direction, which just kind of derails the progress. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. And I think as a group, we've had to just take a chance and be like, okay, these people seem to be like, they want to help and they want to get involved. And I don't think they're here just to derail the process. And just for me, and I think my team holds this mentality too, is you just have to believe in the best in people, at least to open the door until, you know, you get proven wrong. And I think for us, we've been proven right. Honestly, like we've had really amazing conversations, and the people that have sued us in the past have, I would say, like stood pretty firm in their stances, but have also really wanted, you can see it and you can tell that they really want to collaborate to the extent that they're able to. There can be organizational limits to what they can do. You know, if they're working for a certain organization, can run up against that. But overall, it's been a really powerful experience for me to be a part of and witness. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks for the questions, Christy. We're past our time, but I do, if Chris and Lily have a few more minutes, and if anybody does have another question or comment, I'm
gonna say one thing. Back to the Venn diagram, but also Lily, off of what you just said about just asking. So that sweet spot in the Venn diagram, I think, you know, it's so separated because we built silos around these different thoughts, like the economics, the social, and the scientific. And pulling those together just means that we all get curious about all of those things, right? Break down those silos, just ask to collaborate with people that know those other silos better than you, right? And I think we, yeah, get more people at the table, end up doing really cool work as a team, and learn a lot. So I just wanted to throw that in.
What I think is so funny that I have to keep reminding myself of with that is like, you know, we always think like that our thing or our like where we hold maybe some experience and knowledge is like, oh, this is the most complicated aspect of it. And you guys should just come in and it should be easy. Like, come on, how hard is it to do some social science and ask people some questions, right? We'll throw a survey together. It's going to be so easy. And like economics, like we'll just put it in a spreadsheet and like track it. It'll be so easy. And then you actually get into it and you realize like, oh, there's a lot of nuance to asking the right type of questions or putting together surveys in the right way that doesn't lead people, or that is, yeah, legit. And anyway, so I always have to remind myself of that and giving everybody the space, the capacity, the funding that we all share in those resources to be able to show up and do our best in this collaborative work. And yeah, and I will bring up too, if you guys, most people are probably familiar with the whole concept of the radical center. I went back and like read the old invite to the Radical Center. You can find it online through Courtney White's website. It's a great, easy place to find it. I love that there is within that invite at the bottom, there is a specific invite to every player in this and every role, whether you are a consumer, a researcher, a rancher, an agency person, there is a specific invite for all of us to show up in the space and work harder and better together. So I love that. And I was revisiting it recently and yeah. So thank you guys for the time so much, Chris, Lily. It's always fun to chat, as you all know. And thanks everybody else for listening in. This has been recorded and the prior ones were recorded, so they'll be available on the californiarangeland.org website. And we look forward to our next conversation last Friday in June. We'll be talking about community-led policy. So, okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.